bright lights of the Manhattan skyline sparkled outside the towering glass windows of the studio. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Millions of Americans were tuned in, waiting to watch what promised to be one of the most explosive interviews in recent television history. Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative politics, adjusted her earpiece as she took a seat across from the evening's host, Ethan Hayes, a veteran journalist known for his aggressive interview style. He had made a name for himself by grilling politicians, often pushing them to the edge with sharp, often controversial questions. The tension between them was already palpable. Karoline had been invited onto the Ethan Hayes show to discuss the latest developments in the political landscape, but both she and her team knew what this was really about. Hayes had a reputation for cornering conservative voices, and tonight, he seemed determined to make an example of her. The red on-air light flashed on. The cameras rolled. Ethan leaned forward, his signature smirk plastered across his face. Karoline, welcome to the show. Let's get right to it. Why should anyone take you seriously? The question wasn't just condescending. It was a direct attempt to undermine her credibility from the start. But Karoline had expected this. With a composed smile, she responded, Ethan, I think the real question is, why do you feel so threatened by a young, strong, conservative woman who has the courage to challenge the status quo? The audience, both in studio and at home, felt the shift immediately. Hayes had expected her to stumble, to get defensive. Instead, she met his attack with grace and confidence. But he wasn't backing down so easily. He chuckled, shaking his head. Threatened? No, Karoline. I just find it amusing that someone with such extreme views thinks they can represent mainstream America. Karoline's blue eyes locked onto his. Extreme views? You mean supporting free speech, standing for law and order, and fighting for the rights of hardworking Americans? If that's extreme, maybe you should reassess what you consider mainstream. The tension in the room thickened. Hayes, clearly caught off guard by her directness, shuffled his papers. Let's talk specifics. You've made claims about media bias. Are you really suggesting that networks like mine are unfair? Karoline smiled. Ethan, I don't have to suggest it. I can prove it. In fact, this interview is proving it right now. The studio audience let out a collective gasp. Even some of the crew members looked on with wide eyes. Hayes had walked straight into her trap. But this was just the beginning. Ethan Hayes leaned back in his chair, attempting to mask his frustration behind a thin veil of amusement. But his clenched jaw gave him away. He wasn't used to being challenged this directly, especially not by someone as composed as Karoline Leavitt. You're saying this interview is proof of bias? He scoffed, folding his arms. Isn't it a bit convenient to cry bias whenever you face tough questions? Karoline didn't flinch. She was ready. It's not the tough questions I'm concerned about, Ethan. It's the double standards, she replied, her voice steady but edged with fire. When a progressive politician sits in this chair, you treat them with kid gloves. But when someone like me, a conservative woman, shows up, you twist my words, cut me off, and try to paint me as some sort of extremist. The audience murmured. Some nodded in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. But Karoline wasn't done. In fact, she continued, last week you had Senator Reynolds on this show. You praised her for speaking her truth, even when her policies raise taxes on working families. But when I speak about protecting small businesses, you call it extreme. Why the double standard? Ethan's smile faltered for just a second. He adjusted his tie and leaned forward, attempting to regain control. The difference, he said coolly, is that Senator Reynolds presents facts. You, on the other hand, rely on rhetoric and emotional appeals. Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if she had expected nothing less. Facts? She repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Let's talk facts, Ethan. According to the latest report from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, small businesses account for over 44% of U.S. economic activity. Yet, the very policies you defend are driving these businesses into the ground. That's not rhetoric. That's reality. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. And here's another fact for you. Karoline added, her gaze never wavering. When mainstream media outlets like yours suppress voices that don't align with your agenda, you aren't informing the public, you're manipulating them. Americans deserve better than that. A hush fell over the studio. For the first time, Ethan Hayes seemed to be at a loss for words. But it wasn't just her words that stunned him. It was her poise. She wasn't angry. She wasn't flustered. She was calm, factual, and unapologetic. You talk about manipulation, Karoline? Ethan finally said, his voice sharper now. But isn't it true that you've benefited from political propaganda yourself? Some would say you're just a mouthpiece for a divisive agenda. Karoline let out a soft, almost amused laugh. I don't need to be a mouthpiece for anyone, she said. I stand by my beliefs because they reflect the values of everyday Americans, the people you seem to forget while sitting in this studio. And if standing up for those people makes me divisive, then so be it. The studio audience burst into applause, a rare break in the usually controlled environment. Even Ethan, though visibly irritated, couldn't deny that she had scored a point. He tried to regain his footing. Okay, let's shift gears, he said briskly. What's your response to critics who say your views on free speech promote misinformation? Don't you worry that allowing all voices opens the door to dangerous lies? Karoline's expression grew serious. I believe the American people are smart enough to discern truth from lies, she answered. When we start censoring speech in the name of protecting people, we're on a slippery slope to losing our freedoms altogether. And last I checked, the First Amendment doesn't come with a disclaimer. Ethan sighed audibly, but Karoline leaned in, her voice dropping to a softer, yet more powerful tone. Here's the real issue, Ethan. You don't want open dialogue, you want controlled narratives. But America was built on the idea that everyone has the right to speak their mind, even if it makes people uncomfortable. And I, for one, will never apologize for defending that principle. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The usual smugness on Ethan's face had faded. Whether he admitted it or not, she had rattled him. But neither of them realized, at least not yet, that the most shocking moment of the night was still to come. Ethan Hayes shifted in his chair, his polished demeanor beginning to crack. For years, he had controlled interviews with sheer force, interrupting, deflecting, and trapping his guests. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't playing by his rules. And worse for him, the audience knew it. He cleared his throat, grasping for the upper hand. Karoline, you talk a big game about free speech, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But isn't it true that certain voices, let's say, extremist ones, can cause real harm? Where do you draw the line? Karoline leaned back slightly, her face calm but focused. I draw the line where the Constitution draws it, at direct incitement to violence. Everything else? That's fair game. Because in a free society, the best antidote to bad speech isn't censorship, it's more speech. Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Come on, he said, waving a hand dismissively. Do you really believe that the average American can tell the difference between truth and propaganda? Karoline's smile faded. For a moment, her face softened. Less the polished politician, more the concerned citizen. I absolutely believe that, she said firmly. And I find it insulting that you don't. The American people aren't stupid, Ethan. They see through the media's spin. That's why trust in outlets like yours is at an all-time low. Ethan bristled. Are you seriously blaming the media for America's problems? I'm holding the media accountable, she shot back. When journalists stop reporting facts and start pushing narratives, they become part of the problem. And the American people are waking up to that reality. The audience clapped again, louder this time. It was clear whose side they were on. Ethan, realizing he was losing the room, took a different approach. His voice dropped to a calculated, almost paternal tone. Karoline, you're young, he said with a thin smile. Maybe a bit too young to understand the nuances of these issues. Don't you think it's dangerous to speak in such absolutes? The patronizing remark hung heavy in the air. Karoline's eyes flashed with something new, fire. You know, she said quietly, it's funny. No one ever tells young liberal women they're too inexperienced to speak their minds. But the moment a young conservative woman steps up, you question her intelligence. Isn't that the very bias you claim doesn't exist? The audience erupted in applause and whistles. Ethan's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline wasn't done. And for the record, she added, her voice like steel, I may be young, but I'm not naive. I know exactly how this game works. You bring people like me on your show hoping we'll lose our cool or stumble. But here's the thing. You can't intimidate someone who's standing on principle. Ethan's face reddened. For the first time in his career, he seemed unsure of what to say next. You accuse me of speaking in absolutes, Karoline continued, her voice rising just enough to command the room. But let me tell you what's absolute. My love for this country and my belief in the people who make it great. And no amount of media spin will change that. A pause. The kind of pause that only happens when something real breaks through the noise. Then thunderous applause. Even some of the production crew couldn't help but clap. Ethan, visibly rattled, shuffled his notes in a desperate attempt to regain control. Fine, he snapped. If you're so committed to truth, let's talk about your position on social programs. Critics say your policies would strip vital services from vulnerable Americans. How do you respond to that? Karoline didn't blink. I want every American to succeed, not just survive, she said. But the solution isn't more government handouts. It's empowering people with opportunities, through job creation, better education, and less bureaucracy. That's not cruelty, Ethan. That's compassion. Her words hit like a sledgehammer. For the first time, Ethan Hayes looked genuinely speechless. And that's when Karoline did something no one expected. She turned the tables completely. You know, Ethan, she said, her voice soft but powerful. I've answered your questions. Now I have one for you. Ethan blinked. What? Why are you so afraid of people like me? She asked. Is it because we're disrupting the narrative? Or is it because deep down, you know we're right? The audience gasped. For the first time in his career, Ethan Hayes had no answer. And America was watching. Quick-witted and sharp-tongued, sat frozen. Karoline's question hung heavy in the air. A challenge he wasn't prepared for. The audience felt it too. This wasn't just another political interview. It was a rare moment when the power dynamic shifted, and everyone watching knew it. Ethan tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. Afraid? He repeated, leaning back in his chair. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? Karoline didn't flinch. Not at all, she said. Every time someone like me steps up to question the media's agenda, you resort to mockery and condescension. But behind all that, I think there's fear that Americans are starting to think for themselves. Ethan's smile faltered again. He glanced toward the producers behind the glass, but no help was coming. This wasn't a moment he could cut away from. He had to face her. You're making a lot of assumptions, he said, his voice harder now. I'm not afraid. I'm just holding you accountable. Karoline nodded slowly, as if she expected that response. Accountability is a two-way street, Ethan, she said. So let's be honest. When was the last time you held a progressive politician to the same standard you're holding me right now? Ethan's jaw tightened. The question hit its mark. I hold everyone to the same standard, he said through clenched teeth. Karoline smiled, a knowing smile. Really? She asked. Because last month, when Senator Reynolds sat in this chair and defended policies that raised taxes on middle-class families, you called her courageous. But when I advocate for cutting taxes and empowering small businesses, I'm dangerous. What's the difference? The audience murmured in agreement. Ethan was cornered, and they knew it. You're twisting my words, he snapped, his composure slipping. No, Karoline said softly. I'm just exposing the double standard. The studio was electric. Viewers at home, from small-town diners to bustling city apartments, leaned closer to their screens. This was no longer just an interview, it was a reckoning. Ethan, growing desperate, shifted tactics. Fine, he said. Let's talk about your stance on education. You've argued for more parental control in schools. But what about protecting vulnerable students? Shouldn't we prioritize their safety over parents' political agendas? Karoline's expression softened just a little. Ethan, every child deserves to feel safe and supported at school, she said. But safety shouldn't come at the cost of transparency. Parents aren't political threats. They're partners in their children's education. And when schools shut them out of the conversation, everyone loses. Ethan opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. And let's be clear, she continued, her voice unwavering. I'm not against protecting vulnerable students. I'm against bureaucrats deciding what children should learn without involving the people who love those children the most, their parents. The audience broke into applause again, louder and more sustained this time. Even the sound engineers in the back exchanged glances. Something remarkable was unfolding. Ethan, struggling to regain control, tried one last push. Your critics say your rhetoric is divisive. Do you ever worry that you're deepening the divides in this country? Karoline's face grew serious. I'm not the one deepening divides, she said. The people doing that are those who label anyone who disagrees with them as dangerous. Real unity comes from honest dialogue, not from silencing people who have different views. Ethan exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. You talk about dialogue, he said, but your party has spread misinformation time and again. Isn't there a danger in letting every voice be heard? Karoline tilted her head slightly. The real danger, she said, is a world where only voices like yours are heard. The studio went silent again. Even Ethan's usual bravado seemed to fade under the weight of her words. And then something no one expected happened. Ethan Hayes, the man known for his relentless attacks and cutting remarks, sighed. And when he spoke next, his voice was quieter. Maybe you have a point, he admitted. The audience gasped. For a split second, even Karoline looked surprised. Ethan hesitated. I spend a lot of time challenging people like you. Maybe I don't always listen as much as I should. A hush fell over the room. For the first time, Ethan Hayes, the face of mainstream media, wasn't in control. Karoline Leavitt was, and America was watching every second of it. The tension in the studio was almost tangible. For the first time in his career, Ethan Hayes, the media's golden boy, had backed down. His admission wasn't just a crack in his usual arrogance. It was a seismic shift that no one had anticipated. Karoline Leavitt, still poised, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth was already hanging heavy in the air. And the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms felt it too. Listening is a good place to start, Karoline said, her tone softening slightly. Because whether you agree with me or not, the people I represent, everyday Americans, deserve to be heard. And I'll keep fighting to make sure they are. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a man who had built his career on tearing apart conservative figures, this moment was uncharted territory. Fair enough, he said at last, though his voice lacked its usual bite. I'll admit, your conviction is impressive. But some would argue that conviction without compromise only fuels division. Karoline nodded slowly, as if she had considered this question many times before. Compromise has its place, she acknowledged. But there are some values that aren't negotiable: free speech, parental rights, and the belief that government should serve the people, not control them. If defending those values makes me divisive, then so be it. The audience broke into applause once more, louder and more sustained than any point in the interview. Some people even stood up, a rarity for the typically reserved studio crowd. Ethan glanced toward the control booth again. His producers, usually quick to offer cues or cutaways, remained still. There was no saving him from this moment. He had to face it head on. You know, he said after a beat, I may not agree with everything you say, but I respect that you're willing to say it. Karoline offered a small smile. That's all I've ever asked for, she replied. The interview wrapped up a few minutes later, but the shockwaves had just begun. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media platforms exploded. Clips of Karoline's takedown flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, spreading like wildfire. Hashtag Karoline destroys MSM and hashtag Let the People Speak trended nationwide. Conservative commentators hailed her as a new voice for the movement, someone who could take on the media elite and win. Even some liberal voices, usually quick to dismiss her, admitted that her calm composure had exposed something uncomfortable about mainstream bias. But it wasn't just political pundits who reacted. Across America, ordinary people, construction workers on their lunch breaks, stay-at-home moms folding laundry, truck drivers listening in their cabs, felt seen. They heard someone articulate the frustrations they had carried for years. Someone who didn't flinch in the face of media arrogance. In small towns and big cities alike, the conversation shifted. No longer was it just about left versus right. It was about who controlled the narrative and whether the voices of regular Americans still mattered. The next morning, Karoline's phone buzzed non-stop. News outlets from across the spectrum wanted follow-up interviews. Supporters flooded her inbox with messages of encouragement. Donations to her cause surged overnight. And as for Ethan Hayes, for the first time in a decade, the king of primetime found himself on the defensive. His critics accused him of being exposed as a bully. Some even questioned whether he had lost his edge. His employer, always sensitive to public sentiment, quietly began considering whether his once unshakable hold on the network's flagship show was slipping. But perhaps the most surprising message came from Ethan himself. Later that afternoon, as Karoline prepared for yet another interview, an email popped up in her inbox. Subject: Today. Karoline, you caught me off guard. I underestimated you. I still disagree with most of your views, but maybe you're right about one thing. We should listen more. Respectfully, Ethan Hayes. Karoline leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful smile touching her lips. In a world where voices like hers were often dismissed or distorted, today felt different. For the first time, the narrative wasn't being controlled by the media. It was being reclaimed by the people. And this was only the beginning.